All right, well, I'll get started with kind of our introductory announcement things. And we'll probably have a couple other folks trickle in. But my name is Teresa Larson. I am one of your presenters today, but I am also the facilitator. So if you do have questions throughout, you can feel free to send them my way. But just so everybody knows, and hopefully you saw the notification as you entered the meeting, this session is being recorded. We like to share these recordings on our YouTube page so that people who aren't able to attend can see them later. If you are concerned about your visual representation in that video, feel free to keep your camera off. But all voice recordings will be used in that. And then to continue on, I will provide our land acknowledgement at Utah State University, which is that as a land grant institution, Utah State University campuses and centers reside and operate on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah, who have been living, working, and residing on this land for time immemorial. These tribes are the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Indians, Navajo Nation, Ute Indian Tribe, Northwestern Band of Shoshone, Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, San Juan Southern Paiute, Skull Valley Band of Goshute, and White Mesa Band of the Ute Mountain Ute. We acknowledge these lands carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We recognize elders past and present as the peoples who have cared for and continue to care for the land. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous self-governance history, experiences, and resiliency of the Native people who are still here today. To continue on, just as a reminder, we are offering this as a 4-credit social work continuing education credit. So please ensure that your Zoom name matches the name that you want on your certificate, because that's how we take attendance and send those out. And also, just as a notice, we do pay attention to how long folks are in here. If you do have to leave early, that just means you won't receive the credit. But in order to receive that, the full credit amount, you have to be here for the entirety of the session. There will also be a feedback survey sent to you afterward to help us know how you liked this presentation, as well as topics and other directions you would like us to go in the future. I will now introduce our other presenters, and we will get started with our presentation. So like I said, my name is Teresa. I am a social worker and I work at the Transforming Communities Institute at Utah State. My role covers a broad spectrum of macro-related issues around community engagement and research. Our next presenter is JC Sheen, who works in the social work department as a faculty member, who has a variety of research interests from LGBTQ+ issues to disability, as well as macro-related practice. And he also teaches a variety of policy and micro-level courses. And then our third presenter today is Keith Christensen, who's the department head of landscape architecture and environmental planning, who has graciously decided to join us today and share his knowledge about city planning and other realms of planning communities and environments that we all exist in. They can also add to what I've described today about their connection to our topic or other research-related issues. But today we will be discussing 4 main learning objectives. So you all will hopefully be able to understand your ethical obligation to community through the built environment, learn to critically engage your built environment for yourself and for your clients if you were working at a micro level, gain skills for collaboration and influence related to the built environment, and then learn how to engage that process for long-term impact within our communities. And so our next big question to kind of just wrap our heads around and to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward is understanding what is the built environment. Because a lot of times us as social workers, we do think of housing, like number one, that's what it is, built environment, right? Where are we going to live and where are our clients living? But it provides the whole context for our lived experience.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in here because one of the things I want to do in this early part is let you know what we plan to do is give you some context for a conversation that we want to have about actions that you might take after today. So we're going to go through some framing pieces, and then we're going to turn it over to Dr. Christensen to really get into some specifics around the built environment and planning context. But yeah, Teresa and I were talking about this, and we think about affordable housing or the unhoused as kind of a big part, but you think about parks that you recreate in, or where harm reduction sites are located, or where the food deserts that might exist in certain communities. And all of those pieces really, it's so important to understand that the context of the lives that we live and the lives of our clients and the role that that plays. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about the ethical piece. But those of you that know me, Teresa's going to go to the next slide. People that know me know how fond I am, particularly of the preamble of the NASW Code of Ethics. Any student of mine, I bring it up almost every class. If you think about the mission of the social work profession, right, we have this idea of practicing from a person and environment lens, or PI. And today we're going to be fortunate to hear from Dr. Christensen, who has spent so much time designing environments for people. Right. So the emphasis is environment back towards people, and we're person and environment. So the opportunity to work with an allied profession is really exciting to us. But think about this. This is directly from the preamble. This is in the first paragraph of the preamble. A historic and defining feature of social work is the profession's dual focus on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of society. So that is our case to cause. That is our micro practitioners all the way to our macro practitioners. That's the dual focus of our profession. And then it goes on to say that fundamental to social work is attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. And landscape architects and environmental planners are so focused on creating environments that contribute to social justice, that contribute to health and welfare and safety. I was delighted to find out that in the Code of Ethics for Landscape Architecture, and in their history that dates back to the 1800s, their dedication and part of their mission is social justice. They are designing for social justice, which matches so well with our mission to increase social justice, create a more just world. So I'm really excited about the things that Keith's going to talk about. I want to say a little bit about Dr. Christensen. I've known him for some time, and he has devoted his career to developing inclusive spaces and communities. I remember early on, he was designing inclusive play spaces for children with disabilities. And he was really trying to push the paradigm beyond mere access or the minimum standard to have an accessible playground to a playground play space that was inclusive of all people. And I've got fantastic stories of hearing kids that have been in those spaces and their experience. But he's since gone on to really look at the community level and really design communities and work on projects that are researching, developing policy and practices that establish fully inclusive communities, not just around disability, but of all different types of human issues that we deal with. So really delighted to have Dr. Christensen here to share his expertise. We're going to go from the preamble now to Teresa giving you, there's actually very specific pieces in the Code of Ethics that apply to this. So Teresa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, there are a couple of just two pieces that I want to highlight in the Code of Ethics. They fall under ethical, or number 6 in the ethical code, that are all numbered, which is about social work's responsibility to the broader society. So in 6.01, it states that social workers should promote the general welfare of society from local to global levels and the development of people, their communities, and their environments. Social workers should advocate for living conditions conducive to the fulfillment of basic human needs and should promote social, economic, political, and cultural values and institutions that are compatible with the realization of social justice. And so if we break this down a little bit, kind of going back to what JC was saying, which is what was just presented in the preamble, and expanding on it, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the community and the environment. The environmental aspect is something that I feel like a lot of us are cognizant of, but we also can have an impact on how it's created and how it's designed, and engaging that process further as social workers. And hopefully we can also recognize that this is across the micro to the macro practice level and everything in between, because those micro level workers, if you're providing therapy or direct service, there is a realm that you have influence because you know what's going on in your communities with the folks that you're working with. And so it's beyond even that housing aspect that we said, that we were also discussing right at the beginning. Also, it's promoting social, economic, political, and cultural values and institutions that are compatible with the realization of social justice. So when we talk about our communities, we're fulfilling our human needs, we're promoting social justice. Like, what is our harm reduction technique? What is needed around housing? Where should services be provided? And that kind of idea. And then the second ethical piece that I want to highlight that's related is from 6.04, social and political action. And this is just part A of that. And that's social workers should engage in social and political action that seeks to ensure that all people have equal access to the resources, employment, services, and opportunities they require to meet their basic human needs to develop fully. Social workers should be aware of the impact of the political arena on practice and should advocate for changes in policy and legislation to improve social conditions to meet basic human needs and promote social justice. Again, a very similar, just slightly different wording, but this idea of like, even we have to know about zoning laws, or we need to know why things are going places, or even where we can set up our own practice, you know, where are we able to provide services. And so that's also why we're really excited to have Keith here, because he's part of that planning process as like literally somebody who engages that process on a day-to-day basis, which is where we're headed next with Keith, and helping us understand like what is involved in building our communities and inclusive communities and community planning, from his perspective as somebody in a discipline other than social work, to help inform us of what we can do.
All right, that's me, right? Let me get set up here. I'm going to all right, you can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, first off, you know, as I was listening to Teresa and JC, I'm getting a little stressed out because that was a lot of like build up to me now letting you down. So I'm really worried about that. But I would have to say that I don't know why I didn't do this before, but as I was just, JC, as you were presenting that preamble for social work, I had to write that down. Just the attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. That essentially could describe community planning, the fields of landscape architecture, planning, design. It's the same thing. Essentially, we're partners in trying to accomplish the same kinds of outcomes. If you look at the mission or vision for landscape architecture as a field, they talk about landscape architects leading the planning, design, and stewardship of healthy, equitable, safe, and resilient environments, human and environmental health in communities and those environments. So we really have kind of a shared, basically shared values in what we're working on. So I'm very excited to talk about this. I'm actually going to back up a little bit and kind of introduce you to a couple ideas. You can see from this, we're talking this title slide about creating conditions of possibility. You just described those as attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. We often will talk about these as creating conditions of possibility for people basically to be their best selves and experience their best possible experience and environment. So we are actually looking, this is an image of Panama City. And if you see that on the, you can see very kind of clearly defined in this picture that on the west side, the background of this image, there's a Trump Tower in there and some golf courses and some parks, and there's a lot of Americans in that area. But in the foreground on the east side of Panama City, you can see the structures that people are living in. There's much higher instances of poverty. This is where the Panamanians live in this community. What you are really looking at is the physical manifestation of a poverty line. When we talk about people living on one side or the other of the poverty line, well, this is the physical poverty line in the landscape. And so, a couple of rhetorical questions, but what's the experience of a person living on the east side versus a person living on the west side? Which community is the marginalized community? Which community has access to the resources to be their best selves? And then you can ask the question, why is it the line there anyway? I mean, why is there just this actual line in the community? And you see it in a lot of communities. This is just realized are you still looking at my slides here?
Yep.
Okay. All right. There now I apologize for 1 second. I messed things up. So we're going to talk, I messed things up. Now we're going to talk about how we've messed things up. This is actually another poverty line that you can see, and this is a community actually in Mexico. And you can look at that, and I mean, essentially there's a very distinct line between these two communities, and there's lots of evidence in the difference of experience from living 100 feet one direction and 100 feet another direction. And the question really becomes, why is it there? Why is there such a drastic juxtaposition or difference in experience for people? And there's this fascinating, I want to show you this because we see this kind of thing all over the place. And there's this really interesting TED Talk from 2018. Stephen DeBerry, he was an anthropologist and venture capitalist. And he was talking about East Side communities. And a little earlier, I was talking like the west side of Panama City and the east side of Panama City. But the east side of cities, we see this all over the place, where the east side of cities tends to be the community with the social, economic, and environmental disadvantages or margins. East Philadelphia, East Houston, East Austin. Chicago is interesting because it says south side of Chicago. It's really the southeast side of Chicago. It's always, these east side communities are very different, and they're kind of known for being disadvantaged communities. But what do communities on the social and economic and environmental margins kind of have in common? They tend to be on the east side of cities. So the question is, why? Why are they east side communities? And it turns out that it's the wind. If you look at the Earth from the North Pole, at least in the Western Hemisphere, we're talking about east side communities in the Western Hemisphere. The Earth's rotating kind of counterclockwise. And one of the effects of that is that the prevailing wind direction always tends to blow from west to the east. So the wind's blowing towards the east. And what that has led to is something that you might be very familiar with, in that if you're sitting around the campfire, smoke blows in a particular direction. And who sits there? You know, who sits with the wind in their faces, or sits with the smoke blowing onto them? And the answer is almost generally it's people with less power, less political power, less power to affect change in their environment. So this campfire dynamic is what's playing out in cities all around the world, in the Western Hemisphere, and then it changes over in the upper hemisphere, lower hemisphere. But East London, East Jerusalem, east side of Paris, east side of Shanghai, East Bombay, East Panama City that I was just talking about, it's basically the wind is driving pollution towards marginalized communities to the east, is what is happening. And it comes down to this idea of that basically the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting their byproducts. Those with power, the haves, don't want to sit with the smoke in their faces. So when we use terms and we talk about things like being on the wrong side of the tracks, this comes from the idea of the old coal-fired steam locomotives that would go through communities, and the wind would drive the pollution from those in a particular direction. And the being from the wrong side of the tracks meant that the pollution from basically the locomotives coming through was blowing into your community. All right. And those were east side communities. The negative outcomes of community were going in your direction. So that's, I mean, there's a little bit interesting trivia for you, but this is a very kind of understood phenomena, and it occurs, it's pervasive. There's interesting research on this. This is just a fascinating paper you can look at called East Side Story. Nice little play on words there. But it's called Historical Pollution and Persistent Neighborhood Sorting. And they looked at industrial communities, and they can predict the socioeconomics of areas of the community based upon the location of the smokestacks from industrial factories 100 years previously. So the disadvantage from the community perpetuates. It's a persistent neighborhood sorting, that there was some driver that pushed marginalized populations into a particular area. And then that marginalization has occurred way beyond or long past the driver that actually initially caused it. And there's sometimes it's fun to just kind of throw in the formulas that they use, but they looked at basically like 5,000 industrial chimneys in an atmospheric model, and they could basically predict where marginalized communities exist now just based on these chimneys, the location of the chimneys and wind direction. So this is absolutely fascinating. This is the whole fascinating idea. But there's a problem with it, and this caused me to do a whole bunch of research. But does anyone want to just respond with something that just doesn't seem right?
I mean, one thought that I had is that as we're considering the implications of pollution in geographic location, you're also looking at maybe like health impacts and the way that people live, which will, the thought that I have is that it's like a perpetuation of poverty, in the sense that these environmental factors exacerbate problems that people living in impoverished areas will experience on a regular basis.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a compounding problem. You have a marginalized population that's pushed in towards a particular environment because they are marginalized, but then that environment, the very environment that they're in, further marginalizes them. It impacts their health. It impacts their access to education and recreation and so many compounding factors. Now, the flip side to that is you can also have factors that will address those. It doesn't always have to be compounding in the negative, right? It address it, but the fact that we see that this persistent neighborhood sorting, this environmental marginalization of populations in the community continuing after so many years, and particularly in East Side communities, is troubling. But if we look at Utah, is it East Side communities? Think about where you're at, and is it the East Side communities that are the marginalized communities?
It's completely flip-flop to the west side.
Yeah. So you can look at it. So if you're in, I've got a few examples, but if you look at Logan, or you talk about Logan, and I don't want to stereotype or do anything like that, but we can talk about the east side of Logan versus the west side of Logan. And the expectation is that the west side of Logan is a more marginalized population. And this that I'm showing you here is just income level data. And it essentially shows you that income levels on the east side of Cache Valley, or in Logan in particular, they're higher on the east. And the same's true for Ogden. It's east side benches, right? Where you're seeing higher incomes. And it's also extremely true along the Wasatch Front. I mean, basically everywhere from Provo to Cache Valley, the east side are kind of the haves and the west side are the have-nots. And that's oversimplification, but it's a stereotyping or simplification, generalization that kind of holds true. So the question's why? Why this, right? If the wind was driving in other communities, if the wind is driving east side communities to be marginalized, then does that really mean that in Utah the wind generally blows to the west, right? It'd be the same thing. And that's not the case. The wind blows to the east in Utah. All right, that's the prevailing wind direction. So it's not that. And I got fascinated by this, and I looked at all kinds of things to try and really understand this, because we still have this persistent easterly wind. It's not that. It doesn't have anything to do with elevation. It's not other environmental factors like shallow groundwater or radon gas occurrence or anything like that. Or, the potential for liquefaction and earthquakes or like that. But there is a major driver that's pushed marginalized communities to the west in Utah, and it is the wind. Now, just explained that it was that it wasn't the wind, but it is the wind. The wind is blowing to the east. But in all of our previous examples, we were talking about industrial communities. And in Utah, these are agricultural communities. And what's happening is called orographic precipitation. The wind blows the clouds to the east, and then essentially they drop moisture as they go over the mountain ranges. And because of that orographic precipitation, the wind-driven moist air from west to the east, the landscape was much more rich and more fertile in the east. And in an agricultural community, that was the desirable place to be, where the landscape better supported agriculture. And if you go into this, so you can look at, this is basically a precipitation map of Utah, and that you can see that, precipitation in the avenues of Salt Lake is much different than the precipitation in West Valley. And it occurs all throughout Utah, and it's the predictor of where marginalized communities are. You can basically predict where they're at based on historical rainfall from orographic precipitation. And it's fascinating. So I kept digging in this, and, in 1847, the Mormon pioneers showed up, and they found a lot, I think the quote's actually luxuriant grasses, growing on the foothills of the east side of the Salt Lake Valley. So that's where they went. And the lack of moisture was evident in the westward side of the valley because the lack of grasses and the sterile appearance of the soils. So they settled basically. And it wasn't until people with less power started getting pushed out of those areas that they then started to move towards the west. And that was anyway, so I'm spending too much time talking about this, but I find it fascinating. It's just absolutely fascinating to me because it's the opposite of the campfire analogy. This time sitting in the smoke is the good thing, right? But it is persistent. And it comes down to, this is from the Salt Lake Tribune back in 2007. No, not the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, the Deseret News. But there was a whole article. They were trying to debunk myths about East Side schools and West Side schools. Remember, this is all driven by just rainfall for agricultural land, but we're talking about it in 2007. About East Side and West Side schools, and they're trying to debunk these myths, and they've done a bunch of research. And the findings from this were that there was no difference in any negative measures, crime or behavior or anything like that, between East Side and West Side schools. But there were big differences in positive measures. East Side schools were less crowded. They offered more college credit. They were more affluent. They had more specialized programs for talented students. Their teachers in East Side schools had more experience and advanced degrees than the teachers in West Side schools. The high school field trips were to more expensive and exotic locations in East Side schools versus West Side schools. This is what was happening in 2007. It has nothing to do anymore with rainfall in 1850, right? But it's still this persistent sorting. It's not rain anymore. It's not pollution. It's just perpetuation of stereotypes and marginalization of the environments, landscapes, places, the context, the built environment. It's really struggled over because the meanings attached to these places, working with the kind of the built form of the environment, really establish the conditions of possibility for the opportunities for how people live in a place. And you're addressing this, and we're addressing this, and trying to understand it better. It's this, I mean, environmental racism is in environmental disadvantage, environmental racism. It's nothing new, right? It's going on, but because really it is these stereotypes, because where you live determines kind of the stereotypes that are associated with you and the opportunities that you have, basically your conditions of possibility. Marginalized people on the margins have less power to influence societal decisions. So they get stuck with the smoke in their faces, right? And that further marginalizes them. It further marginalizes the place and the people. It's self-reinforcing and it perpetuates. And there's lots of different reasons why it happens, drivers for it happening. but we're involved in trying to address those, trying to address environmental and societal discrimination and disadvantages, to create places where people can be their best selves, and to help people be their best selves and change their places. So a little bit of that. I'm showing you examples. You know, this is from Philadelphia, East Side Philadelphia. This is just looking at tree cover. There's fewer trees in marginalized communities than there are in communities with greater access to resources. The National Geographic just did a great thing in it, where they just took one street in this issue and they followed it basically from one end to the other. And as the demographics, the socioeconomics, as the marginalization of the community changed, the environment changed. Environmental equity approaches, can displace displaces people, and people are affected by these environmental inequities. And community planners and community designers spend a lot of time trying to address these marginalizations from the environment. Not only what's driving it, trying to counteract or mitigate what's driving it, but also to make changes that can drive it in the other direction. So the bottom line of this is that basically the planning and design of places establishes the conditions of possibility for people, their experience, their opportunities, and their persistent self-perception. So we have to work to address these environments, to change the conditions of possibility by removing barriers, unnecessary demands, environmental injustices. It's not a simple process. There's no magic bullet. There's no right answer, but there is kind of a right approach to take. And that's working in partnership with organizations and other people who are trying to affect change in people's lived experiences, by asking why is this the way it is? Why does the community, why does the environment of the community look the way it does? Why is it the way we have found it? Why are people behaving a certain way in a particular place? Does the environment in which they are residing contribute to their behavior? Because that's the behavior that it supports. Or if, it's a much more contemplative form of design and planning besides just asking what something is or how it is, but why is it this way? Talk about creating conditions of possibility. This work's going on, just as there are ongoing drivers of marginalization affecting people within communities. I've lost track of time. Where am I at? Oh, okay. Just as there are kind of these ongoing drivers, not just historical ones, but current ones that are occurring, there are also ongoing efforts to try to address them, okay, to create these conditions of possibility. And this is where there's an opportunity to partner with community planning efforts, community development and design efforts. And some of that, just to kind of give you a context, is every community by legislative act, state law, basically, is required to have a plan for their community. Because lots of little decisions kind of lead to these big environmental injustices, and just the same as lots of little decisions lead to more just and equitable environments. Lots of little decisions. So community planning and design professionals really act as advocates for community members in the face of regulatory and economic and political drivers that might be causing some of these inequities, and do so within this legal framework. It's called LUDMA, which is a great acronym that stands for the Land Use Development and Management Act. It's just the state of Utah basically saying that every community must have a general plan that it is called a general plan that establishes the guidelines for future development and growth. They all have to have a plan, they have to adopt it, and they have to abide by it. And it's meant to address the needs of their citizenry. And that general plan has actually now has four main components or elements. There's a land use element, which is about where housing is located, and industry or employment and agriculture and recreation spaces and open spaces. You know, where are the built environment resources of the community located, and why are they located where they're at? There's a transportation and circulation element to it, which addresses the infrastructure for people to move around a community, and that should support all community members moving around a community. We're trying to plan for that. It's called a moderate income housing element, which is implementation strategies to secure housing opportunities for people with very diverse incomes, so that people can live in the community in which they are employed, the community of their choice, you know, the historic community to which they belong, that they can remain in that community. And as of recent legislative action, there's also a water element that's required in the face of decreasing access to water resources, which, as we talk about decreasing access to water resources, guess which communities are being impacted first? It's the marginalized communities. You know, so when we talk about maybe you need to have less lawn, guess who we're asking to have less lawn first? And less access to that. So we have to kind of address these things. The community planning process in following that, also from legislation, all of those things we talked about have to be done with broad involvement from broad-based citizenry, public and private sector leaders, community interest groups, and multidisciplinary professionals. It's required to do that. And communities actually have a tough time getting broad-based citizenry involvement in what's going on in their community. The multidisciplinary professionals tends to be a lot of planners and designers, transportation planners, urban planners, landscape architects, urban designers, but it also includes community advocates and people such as yourselves. I would just to be quite frank, people such as yourselves. Involve citizenry, always trying to connect with citizens. But also when we talk about public and private sector leaders, for the most part, these tend to be the economic interests of the community. And it needs to be more broad-based, not just economic interests, but social interests and recreational interests and advocates for, you know, for disadvantaged populations and community members that need to be involved in this. There's a long, I'm getting off into the weeds probably here, but there's just this long history of community planning, the reason for community planning being about equitable access to resources. From the Greco-Roman Empire, it was about equitable access to resources. You know, it started with things like sanitation, you know, religion, civic participation. Some of that's continued. It's also grown to address, you know, during the Industrial Revolution, it was all about economics. But modern planning is really this counter to it. You have to think about Central Park that we're looking at here, which was one of the first great public spaces created, which was to offer urban dwellers an experience of the countryside, a place to escape from the stresses of urban life and commune with nature and their fellow New Yorkers. It's really about social equity and justice, places to meet, move, and interact with other individuals. So comes down to, you know, how to participate in this. that I think we're all interested basically in creating spaces that support the behavior of people, to support their best, basically the best opportunities for people to engage in the behaviors that allow them to be their best selves. Now, we tend to focus on spaces to afford these opportunities to meet needs, but the programming aspect of it is massive as well, just and how we can program these spaces to bring people to these spaces, to bring these built environment resources to people, as well as bringing them people to these resources, but really engaging in a partnership to create better communities, to support better communities. So I need to just answer questions at this point, all right? Because I'll keep talking for an hour if you let me do that. So maybe I should stop and ask questions.
Well, and Dr. Christensen, you do need to leave at 12:50, so
Oh, what time is it?
it's 12:47.
Oh,
So Teresa and I can talk about some questions and things like that. But one quick question for you before you go. In your time with planning commissions and situations, how involved have you seen people from the social work profession? Have you worked with social workers before in planning commissions?
I have not actually worked with a social worker as a planning commission member. I know that I have participated with people from the profession, the discipline, as engaged citizenry. Like as a planning commission member, I don't believe a member of our planning commission was a social worker, which honestly should change. But the engaged citizenry, I have, because there will be, as issues come up that a city is trying to address and gather feedback and additional information from, we've had the opportunity for social workers to come and basically share the perspective as the population, their perspective and the perspective of the populations they work with.
So, okay, well, we appreciate your time so much. I do need to let you go. I have other questions for you, but I think Teresa and I can convey some of that.
Yeah, can I just throw out, I want to share kind of a recent example. So right now we've got a student actually in landscape architecture who's been very involved in the design of basically a resource center for unhoused populations, for people who are experiencing homelessness. Basically been designing a resource center to try to address that. And looking at it from the environmental perspective, and that's great. And there's a lot that can be contributed, but there's so much of that experience that's not understood, the lived experience, the human experience, the impact of homelessness, where you need people that understand that that lived experience and can articulate it, partners that you can work with, to really represent people in this process. These professions that I've been talking about are focused on the built environment. And it is about helping people, but the majority of their expertise is focused on the environment. And they're trying to understand that half of the equation about people. And I think that there's just a wonderful partnership, because you understand people, you work with people, right? There's an intersection there where a lot of good things can happen. Because something that might make sense environmentally and according to my best perception of people's lived experience might be the way to go, but I don't know if that perception is totally accurate, right? If that lived experience is accurate, because it's not my lived experience. I need help with people that understand more diverse lived experiences of community members. So And cities need that. They're screaming for it. If anyone on this this Zoom meeting today walked into your city office and said, I'd like to volunteer in some of the general planning, community planning of this community. I'm a social worker. I'm working with your community members all the time. You're not going to leave without an assignment. You're not going to leave without an opportunity to engage or a job. You're not going to leave. So, but all right, I kept talking. My apologies.
No, you're good. Thank you for setting that up, because that's a nice transition into what we want to do with the rest of our time between Teresa and I and the rest of the group. So we're going to transition into more of a conversation. So we appreciate you setting the context for that and for what you're doing to make the world a better place.
Yeah, well, I apologize for having to leave. I really wish I didn't, but I need to. So, and
thank
you'll
you
be better off if I do. So,
All right. Be
Thank
well.
you.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Well, I hope we all learned. I know I learn from Keith every time I listen to him, because the perspective of a community planner is so different, but also similar to what we're discussing today. So I really appreciated that. And we will continue to talk about this, because Keith brought up some really great points that hopefully we can expand to even broader social work concepts. We talked about at the very beginning, but Keith was talking about person and environment, like what setting and what behavior are people living in, what barriers to access, and not even just access, but inclusion. And that means the micro to macro environment of like, what does that look like in our communities? And then building that social capital, like why are things the way they are? What resources do they have? What networks are there? And how is segregation in modern terms building our communities? And so really when we're talking about analyzing our environment, connecting to our clients across the spectrum, we're trying to engage the concepts that Keith was talking about.
So we want to switch into kind of solution focus mode, right? Now that's social workers are good at solution focus. So we have kind of a historical and a contextual understanding of why things might be the way they are in communities around marginalized populations, things like that. Teresa and I really want you all to leave this conversation with a sense of what you can do, a particular action that you might be able to take based on the information that's being shared today. That would be the highlight for us, is you actually take something and you act upon it. And there's going to be all kinds of different levels. So we want to talk through this idea of engaging the process. And my students know for me, it's all about, we need to first understand the process of how these decisions are being made. And then we need to understand where the points of influence are, so that we can exert influence on behalf of ourselves and those that we represent. So this idea of understanding, right? What is the problem? Who is it a concern for? How is it impacting your service provision? It's this idea of you as frontline social workers, people that are out in the community, are often going to be the first ones to understand an environmental issue that might be impacting the people that you serve. You might, from a disability perspective, which is my background, you might be one of the first people to understand that this new community resource isn't fully accessible for whatever reason. And you're going to be the one that needs to bring that to the attention of people to get that mitigated or fixed. Thinking about where you practice yourselves right now. If you're in a private practice or if you're in an agency, how accessible is first of all, your location via public transit? Does it take a private vehicle to be able to get to you easily? Is it an hour-long 3-transfer bus route to get to where you're providing your services? Once somebody gets to your location, perhaps they use a wheelchair. Can they get in to your location? Is the hallways wide enough? Is the bathroom accessible? These are from a disability side of things, but you could take that and extrapolate it to other populations that have a variety of needs. And so you're going to be some of the first people to understand how the built environment is actually impacting your clients. We are often trying to find employment for people with disabilities, and there's a lot of employment opportunities that are not connected to public transit. And so you have this mismatch of, here's a job over here, but they can't get to that job. And so this comes back to community planning. Who is deciding where buses are going? Who decides where bus stops are? And if you have an understanding of how that process of decision-making is made, you have then an opportunity to hopefully influence future decisions and decisions to actually mitigate some of those issues. So that takes us into the engaging, right? So social workers engage at all levels of practice. So this might be something as simple as rearranging some things in your office space. We do this for folks with sensory issues. Like we all use therapeutic lighting. Like I don't have my fluorescent lights on because I find that distracting. And so looking at your own environment of like where you provide services. There's a group here on campus, Savvy. When I walk over to their office, they provide resources and supports for survivors of violence, sexual violence. And you go into their space and it feels calm. It feels healing. It's the lighting, it's the decor. That's a built environment aspect that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to. So that's one level. That's the micro level. Like I can actually adjust my office space. And then there's this whole idea of I can be part of the community conversation about where a grocery store is located to address a food desert situation, or I can decide where a group home for people that are coming out of incarceration might be able to live as they transition into society. So there's all of these different levels that you can figure out how to engage once you understand the process of how those decisions are getting made. Why are group homes located in certain parts of a community? Why is the grocery store here? Where is this happening? So our big push for this conversation is for you to be more aware that there's a whole profession out there that is really largely in charge of these decisions. This is the collaboration piece. If you understand that your community has a plan, a general plan, and that they have a planning commission, and that there are people that are meeting and making decisions on a regular basis about where to locate schools and where to locate other opportunities, that you can be more of a voice and more involved in that. The idea is social workers could be proposing the changes to improve the health of our communities, right? So we can do our small part in our own physical environments and things like that, but we really are a profession that is good at the community organization and programming piece. When we were talking to Dr. Christensen in front of this conversation, it was really about, he's like, we're really good at planning the built environment, but we're not that good at programming. And social work can be really good at programming, but we're not really cognizant all the time of how the planning process goes or the environment. So think about Salt Lake, where you have Pioneer Park, and you have a huge unhoused population. You have a lot of drug use issues and things like that. That park was planned historically for a particular reason, and it's now serving a different purpose. And it's a purpose that maybe is causing friction and tension in a community. And so how do you reclaim that space and actually address the issue that it's now serving? Like, how do you address the need for safe needle exchange and harm reduction things? And where does that programming, should that programming happen there? Or should we design a new space where it makes more sense for that to happen? This is the conversation we're hoping to engage social work and community planners in, is let's think really more intentionally about why is this space being used the way it is? What is the need that it's addressing? And if there's a better space for that need to be addressed, let's create that space, let's plan for that space, and really be intentional about these kinds of things. So if Teresa will go to the next slide, I want to just give you a little bit of an example to prime your pump, but I would love to have ideas from those of you that are listening on what issues you're facing that are built environment that are directly impacting your clients. One of the examples we talked to Keith about, and this is in my community, we have this phenomenon where we have a middle school located next to a grocery store. And so you have these preteens that don't have transportation of their own. And once school is out, a kind of a mob of preteens heads over to the grocery store, and just, frankly, it's a little intimidating when you want to go shop there in the afternoon, because there's just little packs of preteens, and I live with preteens, so I'm not deathly afraid of them, but they're really kind of a nuisance, and they're kind of milling around, and there's shoplifting that's happening, and there's fights that are breaking out, and there's these things that are happening. And so we can look at that and say, well, we just should ban them from the parking lot, ban them from the place, and that'll solve the problem. But what is happening is they have an unmet need. They have a need for socialization space, and the reason they're drawn to a grocery store is there's access to cheap food and shelter from the elements, and it's close. They don't have to have transportation. So if you work backwards from the need, like what is the need of this group? They don't have their own transportation. They don't have something to do until maybe parents get home from school. They don't have supervision. So how do we design a space that meets the need? Well, whatever you're going to do, you probably want to have some food close by. That's one thing that Keith, as a planner, we would say, here's what is the draw. The draw is the cheap food and the proximity and no need for transportation. So how do we create a space that supports programming that's more beneficial to these individuals, and maybe is more productive space for them to be social in? And you would have to take those things into consideration, right? So also in Logan, we have a skate park. That skate park is great for a lot of people. If you can get there, there's public transportation that goes there, but it's really far from food. And cheap food. So you've got teenagers that have no access to cheap food. That becomes its own issue. So these are the kinds of things that we want to be thinking about, like what is the need of this particular group in our community and how well are we addressing it through the built environment? Right now, I don't think Cache County is doing a very great job of giving a productive, healthy space for adolescents to be congregated in ways that are beneficial to them and not a nuisance to others. So that's an idea. So we would love to hear from some of you, what are some issues you're seeing that intersect the built environment and the people that you're trying to work with? This is also a test to see who's still here to get their CEs. Anybody coming up against an environmental barrier to their clients? Emily?
Well, so this is more anticipatory, but we are doing an add-on to our school over the summer, and it's actually going to extend longer than we thought. So in the fall, we're actually going to have a lot of classrooms under construction. Like my counseling office is actually going to be used for the sped room now. And so we're just going to have to figure out how to all be flexible and create a space that's still conducive for a learning environment. I'm going to have to figure out how to merge offices with my director and still have a counseling space for my students. So it's just going to be kind of a little crazy for our students and our staff at the same time. So that's something that we're going to have to figure out over the summer and into the fall for all of us.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That's a really common, supervising practicum students in schools, a really common issue is there's not actually a really healthy space to do the work that we're trying to do with students. I've had students that have been kind of literally in broom closets or trying to provide support out on the playground in the middle of winter. This is the one confidential space they could find as a corner of the play space. And so being advocates for the space to do the job that you've been asked to do is a big part of, it's one of the levels that you can be really involved with. It's where you can really advocate for the needs of your students. So I appreciate that scale of that. And you can do the same things on bigger scales, right? But I appreciate that. Other examples of where there might be an environmental barrier or place that you're advocating for a change in the environment?
JC, actually, I was just thinking back to Emily's conundrum of like how we can talk about between social workers, how we can talk about our built environment and the space around us, because like you were highlighting, this isn't an uncommon issue. And so how can we as social workers come together to address the problem, maybe at a bigger scale, right? Like going to the school board and stating, you know, this is the concern, is like mental health in our education system is a priority. It's a discussed priority. Like, how can we create the right spaces? And so it might seem very difficult and hard to navigate just by yourself in your school, but we clearly know that this is a broader issue. And so finding that ability to just discuss with our colleagues what that looks like for us and coming together to address the problem at a larger issue to have all of our needs met, which I hope is something that feels more doable as well when you have that kind of community support within the profession. So even though like JC and I might not have answers to like that problem, Emily, I feel like there is a potential for collaboration, not even just with city planners, but with your social work community to address the issue.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, you know, this is if we see that it's a bigger issue, right? Like this is potentially a legislative issue of making sure there's dedicated space within our schools for appropriate counseling settings. It goes along with the idea of schools have become kind of de facto mental health agencies. And we have school social workers that are underpaid. We have school social work interns that are not paid, and we have space that's inadequate. So that is a professional opportunity for us to advocate for a built environment that's as well as other financial resources that support the work that we're being asked to do. And it's critical work. So that's where that takes me as well. So Annalee, you have your hand up, so please.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a different conversation, but I was just talking to our clinical director this morning about telehealth and how we have so many more clients wanting to come in person. But at the same time, we offer this telehealth because we all got kind of good at it over COVID, better at it. And how it seems like there's this trend for those that are wanting telehealth services, they're seeking those particular platforms or agencies that aren't even in their community. And so how can we help people in our community maybe access telehealth? And then when they are doing telehealth, how can we help provide that environment, whether it's their home or like a parked car? And, you know, like it's just, so that's kind of an interesting environment question. And I don't think there's an answer, but it was just on the top of my head as far as creating a good space for telehealth sessions with our clients.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Actually, Teresa and I were having this conversation, I think yesterday about this. So telehealth is this amazing thing, right? It reduces so many environmental barriers as far as access, as long as there's a legitimate internet connection. And we see that in marginalized communities, right? There's certain places where there's a good Wi-Fi connection to be able to host that bandwidth and to be able to see each other's faces over video and all of that. So on the one hand, it solves a lot of issues about transportation and all of those things. On the other hand, you know, what is the environment? What is the context of the person receiving this telehealth? Like you likely have an office, either at home or in a workspace that's confidential, but on the receiving end, are they in a parked car? Are they walking around the park? Are they in the house at the kitchen table with 4 kids doing homework? And what's the confidentiality space on their side and the adequacy on their side of actually being in a physical space that allows them to hear what you're saying and engage in the therapeutic process. And so I think that's a huge issue that our profession needs to really address head on, because it's working well for us on the therapy side, but how well is it working? Again, a lot of pros about the accessibility and all of that. And then maybe we need to pay a little bit closer attention to what is the receiving environment like, and is there a way to set up in public libraries more quiet spaces, more, you know, those study rooms where you can reserve it, and so it is confidential, there is good bandwidth, and how do we intentionally work on policies at a library level to allow that to be a space? How do we partner with those folks? It's a great question, Annalee, and it's something we need to really be thinking about. Teresa, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I live in a more rural space than JC does. And so like internet in my area is always an issue just for day to day, not even for like therapy. But thinking about even at a community level infrastructure, you can work with community planners to discuss like, how do we get like internet access to our communities in a way that is beneficial and accessible to the everyday person, whether that to use like city and or county like level funding to support that kind of infrastructure. What does that look like to invest in our communities in that way? Which I think can be justified in a lot of ways to even beyond mental health support, but other service provision. That's a discussion. I'm working on a project right now about domestic violence in my area, and how do people access services if they don't have the car in the rural space, and if they don't have this, but it's, difficult to fund a bus stop in a town, like a city that's 30 minutes away from where the services are. Just like, what does that look like? And so these kinds of conversations about access to all sorts of services can be helped with internet access.
Yeah, and I think this, I mean, the opportunity for creative solutions can really come from the social work side of this, because again, we're some of the first people to identify and see a need. And Annalee, I was just thinking, you know, some of the things creatively that agencies and providers could do is maybe you have a small stock of Chromebooks that you as a client comes and they don't have access, there's a Chromebook available to them. Maybe the agency has some funds that provides some loaner phones that create hotspots, right? Like these are things that we can do to address deficiencies in the built environment in a way to support this in the meantime, while we're working on these bigger issues of infrastructure and things like that. I think there's really opportunities for some creative ways to think about this if we think about it, right? And that's the thing, we're starting to think about these things. Before we just didn't really think too much about it. The idea behind this really for today is social workers are really, really good at figuring out who are the decision makers. And we're really, really good at organizing and putting together advocacy to influence those decision makers. And we just feel like this is kind of maybe a blind spot for a lot of us, that we don't understand who's actually making a lot of decisions around built environment in our communities. And there's zoning commissions and there's planning commissions. And like Keith said, if you were to go and engage, even as a participant in some of those meetings, to have a voice there and represent your clients as well as yourself, and even, you know, the ethical obligation that, you know, some of us might want to be on a planning commission or volunteer at the city office to like review plans or to give input into plans, to be more engaged citizens on these decisions that are being made that impact the people that we're serving. I think that's kind of the push, is understand who's making the decisions in your community and then get engaged with them. You already have those skills as a social worker, the interpersonal skills, the advocacy skills. We just wanted to open you up to a whole idea of new people you could be collaborating with. And that could be the design professionals in your community. And like Keith said, every community is required by law to have one of these general plans. So going and asking as a citizen, as a social worker, can I take a look at the general plan? I understand we have a general plan. I've never looked at it. I'd love to see it. How do I get involved in the process? And just start asking those questions. You're likely going to be invited very quickly into those circles where these conversations are being had. Teresa, would you go to the last slide? So there's short-term things we can do, and there's long-term impacts. And Keith made a good point of this. I've linked an article here to a Civic Health article that just came out at the beginning of this month, actually. And it really talks about the impact that our actual infrastructure has on people's health. This is an intersection with public health metrics and things like that. And it's this idea that when you have better access and you have more inclusive communities, you have better life outcomes. That's not a surprise to us. So what do we do about ensuring that that is actually happening? And for me, this conversation always comes back to, how do I want the world to be? And how would I like to be in the world? If I want the world to be more inclusive, then I need to figure out what I can do on my level to be a more inclusive person individually and to think more collectively. And so I want to just show, I think I'm going to share the screen because I think there's a really great tool here for you all. So I have opened this article on my side. So Teresa, I'm going to share my screen for me if that's okay. So if you go into this article that we've linked, there's a couple of tools here. And you can see it's from April 4th. It's got a great example of a place in Cornelius, Oregon that has designed a library community center space that is right adjacent with 55 and older housing, and it's close to transportation. There's a really good example of how they very intentionally built a space to bring the community together and to meet a lot of needs. So that kind of runs throughout this article. But one of the cool things in this article is some really current research. And I actually pulled up, you can actually go in here and you can just type in your zip code. So this is Logan zip code, it brings up Cache County, and it will give you some really good information. So Cache County actually ranks 5 of 28 counties, so that means one county didn't get ranked, But we're 5th of 28 on these health outcomes. And there's just a lot of really interesting information that could be useful to you in different ways. It shows you, if you go down to the bottom, it gives you data on the length of life and quality of life and different health behaviors and how we rank both against Utah as a whole and the United States. So you can see food environment index. You can find some of the issues that you're probably dealing with in your clients, like alcohol impaired driving deaths. We've got a very low average here versus the state versus the country. That maybe something's working well. So what is working well and how do we get it to other communities? You can look through where we're deficient and find potential solutions, right? Look at our mental health provider ratio, 500 to 1 versus a Utah average is 270 to 1 or 304. So we have a really need to figure out how to address that barrier. So anyway, there's really cool things in there, but the other thing that's in that article is a whole database of what works to actually improve things in all of these different behavioral areas. What are some things that are happening that are improving these things in other communities that you might be able to advocate for in your own community? So if we look at access to care, there are strategies that have been researched that can help improve access to care in your profession. So you look through this and they're all given an evidence rating level, and you can sort by this level. If you come down here, there's a scientifically supported, there's some that have some evidence, there's some that are based on expert opinion, and there's some that have insufficient evidence. So you can sort by that and really go to your issue and then try to find the strategies that have the most evidence for them. And that gives you tools to then address issues you've identified. So again, you might be the first one to identify an issue. You can now go look at how your county and your community stacks up against that, and then you can go further and find solutions that have worked other places to give you ideas of what to advocate for to address a particular issue in your community. So when we start thinking about, and Teresa, you can go back to sharing your screen, long-term impacts, we're going to need evidence-based ideas. We're going to need to understand the issues. And we think that in this article that we linked here, there's some nice tools for you to explore further to get ideas that might resonate with you on the particular issues. Teresa, do you want to say other things about this?
Yeah, that like JC was saying, that article is actually really just like a very succinct way to think about our built spaces and how they impact our communities at the micro individual level. But then as we think broader to kind of some of these discussion points that we had just a minute ago, and also with what Keith was discussing of inclusion versus access, economic, environmental, and social justice, like really taking the time to understand your clients and also asking questions of those that are making decisions, like, and figuring out the history of what's going on in your community and why it is the way it is, geographically based, and why things are placed in certain areas. It will impact how people engage with the therapeutic relationship. If you can understand your community in such a way that you're like, okay, we're making goals in our therapeutic relationship, but the environment that they're in isn't conducive to achieving that goal, whether that be they're trying to take their own personal physical health and improve that, what is their access to areas in their community that provide support for that goal, right? How close are parks? How close is a community center with like exercise equipment? How close is a doctor? What kind of transit can get them to those places? And building that idea will help us fill out this idea of how our communities are understood within that context. Another example that I've come across recently, and I've been asking questions in my community, has been around like busing systems and where the bus stops are and why they aren't certain places. And you come to learn that, the zoning and the way that this community has engaged in the past and what is considered the city proper and what is considered not has impacted where they've put bus stops. And so folks that all their services are in town and technically are in like driving distance, quote unquote, they don't have access to bus stops because of the relationship between the unincorporated and the city proper. And so it's really fascinating to look at how it's also around a low income area, and now they don't have access to the city that, that they need. But again, that's kind of a very specific example, but understanding our communities and why they are the way they are, just really helps us understand the previous and how whatever decision was made creates a long-term impact now, but then how what we're doing has long-term impact for the future. But I don't think I have anything else beyond that. If you really have questions, so like we've got a couple minutes left here that we can chat. We can discuss any further things that you all are experiencing.
Yeah, Teresa, I just want to do a quick summary statement too. In a clinical setting, you're trying to support behavior change. And one of the things we want you to be aware of is you might be supporting or advocating for behavioral change with your client that is actually coming up against an environmental barrier that you may or may not be aware of. And if you are seeing this environmental barrier, it's actually going to help your client address the behavioral change you're trying to support, but maybe not until that barrier is mitigated or addressed. And so this is, again, that dual focus of social work. There's the individual well-being we're trying to support, but we do that in the context of the community. And if there's community barriers to that, we need to figure out how to work across all of those levels. I think Teresa and I would love for each of you today, like our ask is that you pick one action that you could take based on information you've heard today. It could be a very small action, just even being aware of something. It could be reading this article and thinking about something different. It could be going down to the city office and signing up for the planning commission, Tyrell. It could be something like that. But just think of something you can take action on, right? So this isn't just like a moment we shared and then that was nice, but now we're done. We really would love for you to take some action based on what you've learned today. As Teresa said, we do have some time for questions or comments. We'd love to have those if you have any. And Tyrell, you really don't need to do that for my class. You don't have to be on the planning commission.
JC class is ending in 1 week, so
Extra credit.
Oh, okay.
Anybody have one thing that was surprising that they learned from this presentation? Like one thing that I hadn't thought about that.
One thing that I thought of based on like what Heath was talking about, I thought that he was trying to lead us to thinking about like red line districting as the result of like Utah's swapped directional kind of discrepancies, which I mean, that is part of it, but he went back even further to why the land was more desirable, and then the that thing happened, like as a result of that. So I thought that was really interesting because I was certain that he was going to lead into that, but that wasn't even really a point. So.
Yeah, and that's a side that social work is more familiar with, right? Is the redlining and the discrimination in housing policy and where people can buy property and live and all of those kinds of pieces. But it is interesting to know the historical roots of like, oh, that's why it's flip-flop. Thank you. Other thoughts?
It was interesting to me, and of course, being a school social worker, like the East Side versus West Side schools, that there wasn't really much of a difference in the negative measures. I thought that there would be more, but the big difference in positive measures, which wasn't surprising, but I think that just leads to more of that conversation of, income differences and things like that in those marginalized communities and where the resources are going. And it just, expands on those differences as people go further and further in life because they are having more of those, really great field trips and more concurrent enrollments and things like that, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, Keith talked about planning for possibility. And for me, that comes back to in social work, we talk about access to the opportunity structure. And depending on how much access you have to the opportunity structure, that is really the trajectory of your life. And so as social workers, as engaged community members, if we can help shift the built environment in a positive direction to provide greater access to the opportunity structure for the people that we're working with, that is going to shift the trajectory for their outcomes. It also is going to lead to healthier communities overall, which we all benefit from, right? Like, this is not like we've got to lift this person and put this person down. It's like, how do we design so that everybody is lifted into a healthier space and has more access to opportunities, more equitable planning. I think that's where social work has a strength. We understand disparity and equity issues, and we can really be vocal advocates for more equitable community design across all populations. We have a couple minutes left. Any other thoughts?
Going along with that thought, JC, one of the things that he really left me with was this idea that we start from the disability population perspective to begin with these kind of conversations, so that while we're building these built environments, we are taking into consideration some of those needs that traditionally don't get addressed adequately. And then we have to go back in those spaces and readdress that. I really appreciated that he said, we start out foundationally from that perspective, so that when we're building these environments in this really intentional framework, that we actually take that into consideration, so that we don't have to go back and redo things. It really struck me when he said that, like, starting from the perspective of people that are disabled or experiencing disabilities, and then building the environment from there. So I'm still pondering that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Melissa. Being proactive is much, financially it's cheaper, and ethically it's easier, and it's just easier all the way to be thinking ahead. Teresa?
Yeah, I just like really highlighting that intentionality piece. And so whether it be disability or whatever population we're working with, being very intentional about, if we are starting, especially from like a blank slate with something, just having that intentionality of who is this for and how can we meet the needs prior to them even coming into the space. And kind of, yeah, just like building that, having that built-in access and inclusion prior to them even engaging our programs or systems.
Real quick, since we're at the very end, but that made me think, Teresa, of like the Encircle houses. That whole idea, it's very intentional that for the LGBTQIA+ population, that they look like homes, that they have a home feel, that they're designed externally and internally to provide that kind of a space. That's a very intentional and very supportive of that particular population's needs to feel like they have a place that is safe and home-like. So I think that's another example that's different than disability, but it's that whole point that Teresa is making. It's about intentionality. It's about really understanding the needs of the populations we work with and advocating for them. Teresa, I'll let you have the last word. I think we're at time.
Yeah, that is time, but we appreciate everybody kind of just staying till the end, because I really enjoyed and appreciated our conversation today and learning. And I just threw up our social media stuff for the Transforming Communities Institute, but like even learning from this multidisciplinary aspect of social work and architectural planning and landscape and our environment is really important, and being able to build those bridges to other professions is vital to social workers ourselves, because we can't do everything by our lonesomes, right? That would be unrealistic. But to finish off this wonderful session, like I said, I put up the Transforming Communities Institute social media pages because we host these on our YouTube, these recordings. So if you do, they're usually up within a week or two. And if you do want to share them with other folks that you think could benefit from hearing this conversation, please do. But we post regularly on Facebook and Instagram about exciting events, upcoming opportunities, or just like really great things happening in our communities around the state of Utah. So check that out. For the continuing education certificates, those will be coming within about a week. So if you haven't gotten them by then, please just let me know, because I send those out. And if you would like to be a part of the TCI community continuing forward, We do have a newsletter that you can be a part of. Just put that in the feedback survey when you get it in the follow-up email. There will be a section to say, I want to be part of the newsletter, and we will send those out regularly with our upcoming opportunities. We do these monthly during the same day and time, the third Friday. There's only one time that it's not going to be that this year. But the third Friday of every month, variety of topics from micro to macro. So we hope you all will engage with us further. But other than that, if you have any further questions or just want to chat, feel free to stay on the call. Otherwise, we appreciate you being here, and hopefully we see you next time.